let's talk about Russia now then, because Russia, I think, is one of the only potential big winners in this. Shashank, both in terms of a higher oil price, but more broadly strategically, how do you see Russia coming out of this?
So I think there's lots of good news for Russia. There's sort of small bits of good news. The fact that air defense interceptors that might have been sold for Ukraine, particularly for its Patriot missile defense system, are being chewed up at this extraordinary rate by the Gulf states and by the United States, and demand will be diverted. And that will mean fundamentally in the next 12 months, more Russian missiles will get through. And that's good news for Russia. But I think beyond that, we're also seeing perhaps holes develop in the sanctions architecture. So, for example, the waivers granted to India by the United States. And that's not in itself a big deal, but it's the beginning of a wedge, I think. And then more broadly, you step back, and this is where the biggest effect is. As we've discussed so many times around this table, Russia's economy is suffering some serious pressures. And it's not that it was bound for a crisis, it's that it was highly vulnerable to an external shock. If an external shock came that sort of hit the economy, it had no buffer left. And we saw that in so many ways. Russia dipping into gold reserves, the increasing fiscal pressure of mobilizing more men by paying them bigger and bigger salaries, on and on and on we could go. What this has done is stick a safety net under Russia. It's brought it space to breathe. And therefore, how does that affect Russia's incentive to negotiate when it already really, as we've established again and again and again, wasn't jumping for a deal? It pushes that further away. In my view, that's actually very bad for Donald Trump. It certainly is very bad for Europe and for Ukraine.
I agree with that. I'll just say one thing since we're on Ukraine. I mean, Russia's problem on the front line is not a lack of money. It's a lack of a way to convert manpower and weapons into advances. And I don't think this changes that. It just buys a bit more time and changes the incentive structure.
I'm going to hold that thought there, because otherwise this will turn into a Ukraine discussion. But Russia seemingly one of the few winners out of this. Let's just go round the other areas of the world, not just in the impact in the very short term, but in the sort of medium term too. And Greg, I want to start with you with the Gulf, because let's play out if the Straits of Hormuz presumably are not going to be closed forevermore. So at some point, some kind of an agreement will be reached, but it is one where Iran has, because its aims are so limited, it has shown itself to have relatively more clout than it might have had before. How does that change the sort of geopolitics of the Gulf? What does it mean for Gulf stability? This is a region that has prided itself on having loads of capital and being business friendly and being a stable kind of new growth engine for the world. Is all of that out of the window now?
It means they are going to have to fundamentally reassess their place in the world. I think there's been a lot of premature doomerism already. There are people talking about how Dubai is done, the Gulf is done. I think that goes much too far. I think that's premature. I think this region will still have capital. It will still be business friendly. It will still be attractive to lots of international firms. But I think after the war, the Gulf is going to have to make a choice. If we assume that the Iranian regime is going to survive the war in some form, diminished but hostile, and as you say, now with the demonstrated capability to attack and disrupt life in its neighbors, Gulf states have one of two things that they can do. Either they can try to cut a deal with that regime. They can essentially let themselves be blackmailed and make a deal whereby they offer some trade and investment and perhaps diminish America's military role in their countries. Iran would like to see that happen. I find it very hard to believe that Gulf states would do that after having been bombarded for weeks by an Iran that they had worked for years to improve relations with, and they're being thanked for that. By being attacked. There's a lot of anger directed at Iran in this region right now. The other path they can go is to double down on their relations with America, try to build up more of their own indigenous military capability as a deterrent. They have lots of advanced weapons, but in some cases their militaries are not terribly proficient at using them. And they can go that route. I think they are more likely to do that. But then that will change everything from the business climate in the Gulf to the social contract that Gulf states have with citizens and with residents. If you no longer have that guarantee of this is an oasis of stability in a turbulent region, the Gulf is going to look very different going forward, but it's too early to say what it's going to look like.
So if that's the case, if the Gulf to some degree is going to face a different future than it would have done just 3 months ago, let's do the same analysis for Asia. And let's start with China, because there's a really interesting set of impacts on China. On the one hand, Iran was a source of energy, and is a source of energy for China. On the other hand, this is using up an enormous amount of US weaponry. THAAD missiles launchers have been moved from South Korea to the Gulf. It's also presumably going to have a knock-on impact on the United States' appetite for these kinds of things in the future. How do you put those things together, Ed?
It's complex. I'd say that the first point is that I think, kind of intentionally or not, the United States has demonstrated a serious choke point for China. You know, if the United States wanted to stop oil going through the Strait of Hormuz in a war with China, that would have a very, very big effect. So that's the first thing. And I think that Trump might quite like that, having had the same thing done to him.
Except the United States isn't able to do this.
Except it isn't doing it now. So that's the first thing. But it does demonstrate choke points. It also, I think, demonstrates the extraordinary sort of technical proficiency of the US military machine. I mean, strategically, this war might be a mess. Its outcome might be bad. But in terms of just the operations, the US has been remarkable.
Really? Do you really think that's going to be the conclusion? I mean, I would have agreed with that a week ago.
Well, that's on the plus side. On the negative side, I think it blunts America's appetites for fighting wars. I think it does Donald Trump in the end. He comes out of this a loser. I don't see how it comes out of this conflict a winner. And I think that is something that China will also think has been very disruptive. So China will bank all of those three things on the positive side of the balance sheet. And the net effect, I think, is probably marginally positive for China.
Shashank, do you agree with that? How do you think China will view America's military successes and not in this crisis?
Well, China, remember, the 1991 Gulf War was a seminal moment for China. It saw what America did with satellites, precision bombs, all of this stuff, and it thought, wow, we need some of that. And that set them off on this 30-year path of modernization. So I think in terms of the American ability to exquisitely track all of Iran's leadership and conduct this totally undisputed air superiority over Iran, that will be a source of it'll impress them. But having said that, we've seen, even in this incredible age of being able to find and strike missiles, and in 1991, America could barely find Saddam Hussein's Scud missiles, Scud hunting. It was a total failure. This time around, they've hit loads of them. But it turns out, as I've said at the beginning, hitting loads isn't enough. As long as you have a stockpile of these, you can cause immense chaos. And it's also established, I think, America's interceptor stocks are just insufficient to cope with long, protracted conflicts. And so if we assess only the next 2-year period before American defense industry can transform itself, I think Chinese will look at their chances of a protracted conflict and their endurance and stamina in that and think, we fancy our chances.